Story number 1. The Unseen Warden. It was late, the kind of late when even the air seemed to hang heavy, and the walls of Eastern State Penitentiary whispered secrets in the dark. Inside, everything was still except for the occasional rustle of rats scurrying in the shadows, and the distant sound of keys rattling down the long, empty corridors. But those keys weren't carried by any living man. Once, there had been a man named Thomas Price, an inmate, a prisoner among many others who'd passed through the unforgiving gates of Eastern State. He'd been sentenced to life for a crime he didn't commit, one of those mistakes that found their way to the wrong person. The prison, with its looming walls and haunted history, had been his home for decades. In the time he spent locked away, he had seen things that no one ever talked about, not even the guards. The whispers were constant, low and steady, just enough to drive a man mad. But the one thing that really chilled him was the warden, a figure no one ever really saw but everyone feared. The warden's presence was felt in the cold, in the silence between the screams of the damned. Some said he was just an old ghost of the past. Others claimed he was a force far worse, something that controlled more than just the cells, more than the men inside. It wasn't until the end of Thomas's sentence that he truly understood. When he died, it wasn't peaceful, it wasn't quick. The warden made sure of that. Years passed, and the prison fell into disrepair. But Thomas's spirit, his restless, bitter soul, never left. There was no escape from the grasp of Eastern State, not even after death. For years, he watched from the darkness, wandering the halls that had once been his nightmare. The others had come and gone, long forgotten by the world, but Thomas never left. The keys still rattled in the dead of night, but no one was around to turn them. One night, as the wind howled through the broken windows, a group of urban explorers dared to step inside, armed with flashlights and cameras, looking for thrills, looking for ghosts. They didn't know that something far worse than any ghost awaited them in the shadows, something that had been waiting for decades, thirsting for revenge. As they made their way deeper into the heart of the prison, the air grew colder, their breaths visible in the flickering light. The sound of the rattling keys echoed down the corridor, louder now, like a prison bell tolling for their doom. The explorers froze, their eyes darting around in the dark, but they saw nothing. No guard, no warden, just the unsettling sound of those damn keys. "Did you hear that?" one of them whispered, but no one answered. Their nerves were shot, each step heavier than the last. The walls seemed to close in on them, and the silence was thick, oppressive. As they continued, the sound of the keys grew louder, echoing with each step like a countdown to something inevitable. They turned a corner and stopped dead. There, at the far end of the hallway, a door creaked open by itself. The same door Thomas had seen all those years ago. The warden's office. The door swung open, but no one was there. The cold was unbearable now, seeping into their bones. The rattling of keys was so close, they could almost feel the vibration in their chests. But still, no one was around. No one except the spirit of Thomas Price. In the blink of an eye, the temperature dropped. The walls seemed to pulse with a dark energy. Then came the voice of the warden, soft but powerful, like a shadow in the room. "You'll never leave. None of you ever leave." The explorers turned to flee, but the corridors twisted, turned, became endless. The door they had entered through was gone. Every turn led them back to the same place. The walls seemed to close in, crushing the air from their lungs. Panic set in, but there was no escape. The prison had already claimed them, just as it had claimed Thomas. Outside, the wind howled again, but inside, all was silent except for the clinking of keys, rattling, like the chains of a long-dead prisoner. A sound that would never be heard by any living soul again. Because in the end, it wasn't the prison that held them. It was the unseen warden. And
Story
he had never really
number
left.
2.
The face in the wall. Adam had always been the curious type. Ever since he was a kid, he'd been drawn to things most people avoided: the old, the forgotten, the haunted. So when he found himself standing in front of Eastern State Penitentiary, a place known for its history and decay, he couldn't resist. The crumbling walls called to him, as if whispering secrets he was too eager to hear. It wasn't just the prison that interested him, it was the stories. The rumors of ghosts and curses that clung to the place like the damp that dripped from its walls. He wasn't supposed to be where he was. Most of the visitors stuck to the main hall, the well-lit sections where the guides led tours. But Adam? He'd always been a little different. He slipped away from the group, his footsteps quiet on the cold, cracked floor as he wandered into the darker corners of the penitentiary. There, in the back of one forgotten hall, he found something strange. It was an old wall, half covered in dirt and peeling paint, like it had been untouched for decades. But there was something about it, a feeling that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. Adam approached slowly, his flashlight beam flickering over the surface of the stone. His eyes narrowed, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. At first, it seemed like nothing more than cracks and discoloration. But as he leaned in closer, his heart skipped a beat. There, carved into the stone, was a face so detailed, so real, that it almost seemed to be alive. The eyes were hollow, sunken deep into the stone, but they felt alive, like they were watching him. The mouth was twisted in a silent scream, a tortured expression etched into every line. Adam's breath caught in his throat as he traced the edges of the face with his flashlight. It was so clear, so vivid. How could it have been there for so long without anyone noticing? He stepped back, feeling a cold chill sweep through the air, though the room was stuffy and warm. He shook his head, chalking it up to the weirdness of the place. Just an old carving, he muttered to himself. But as he turned to leave, something made him stop. A soft whisper, barely audible at first, seemed to brush against his ear. It was a low, unintelligible murmur, like someone speaking just out of reach. Adam froze. He turned his head quickly, but there was no one there. Just the dim, empty corridor stretching on into darkness. His heartbeat quickened, and his skin prickled with an uneasy sense of being watched. He shrugged it off. Maybe just the wind, he told himself, though the air didn't move. The whispers came again, louder this time, and unmistakably clear. They were words now, frantic, pleading. Help, me. The voice wasn't from a living person. It was more like a presence, an energy that filled the space around him. His pulse raced. He looked back at the wall, the face, and felt an overwhelming sense of dread. The eyes in the stone were different now. They seemed deeper, darker, more real, and they were staring directly at him. It wasn't just a carving, he knew that now. Help me. Free me. The whisper was louder, a harsh rasp in his ear, and Adam staggered back, his back hitting the cold stone of the opposite wall. His breath came in short gasps. What had he done? What had he uncovered? The whispers turned to frantic shouts, desperate, angry, unnatural. Your soul. I need your soul. Adam's eyes widened. It wasn't just a voice anymore. It was a presence that surrounded him, pressing in from all sides. The face in the wall, the eyes, they were alive. He could feel them boring into him, pulling at him. He could hear the scream of the man trapped inside, the torment, the endless suffering. This wasn't just a face, it was a prison. His hands shook as he reached for his phone, but it slipped from his grasp, clattering to the floor. The air grew colder, the whispers louder, and the stone seemed to shift, closing in around him. The face... No, the spirit inside it was reaching for him. Adam tried to run, but the walls twisted. The corridors stretched endlessly. He was lost in a maze of stone that seemed alive with hunger. "Give me your soul. You will be mine." He couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The air felt thick, suffocating, and his chest tightened as the cold stone pressed in on him. He reached out, desperate, clawing at the walls, but his fingers met nothing but more stone. The face in the wall grinned, a horrible, twisted smile that was neither human nor ghostly, just pure, raw malice. And then Adam knew. The man in the wall had never left. The carving wasn't just a memory, it was the final, tortured imprint of a soul trapped for eternity. And now it wanted him. As the whispers became a scream in his ears, Adam's vision blurred, his body frozen in place, his soul slowly being torn from him. The last thing he heard, as the darkness took him, was the voice of the man who had been trapped for so long. "Now, you are mine." When the next tour group arrived, the wall was still there, the face still staring out into the darkness, waiting for its next victim. Story number 3. The Unforgiven Choir. It was a cold, moonless night when the group of paranormal investigators arrived at Eastern State Penitentiary. They'd done their research, watched countless documentaries, and heard all the rumors about the spirits trapped inside. But nothing could have prepared them for what they were about to face. The prison, with its crumbling stone walls and long, empty hallways, felt like a tomb. The weight of history pressed down on them, a silent reminder of the countless souls who had suffered within these walls. For the investigators, Olivia, Mark, Chris, and Sarah, it was just another job, a chance to capture something unexplainable. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, they started to feel something different, something darker. They set up their equipment, cameras and recorders, positioning them in the most notorious parts of the prison. The old cells where the worst of the criminals had once been kept. The air was thick with dust, and the smell of decay clung to everything. Still, they were excited. This place had been the subject of hundreds of ghost stories, and tonight they hoped to finally capture something real. Hours passed, and the night grew colder. The only sound was the steady hum of their equipment and the occasional click of a camera. It was around midnight when they first heard it. At first, it was barely audible. A distant sound, like someone humming a soft melody. It floated through the air, coming from somewhere deeper in the prison. Olivia's breath caught in her throat as the others turned to her, confused. "What is that?" Sarah asked, her voice shaky. Olivia couldn't answer. The melody grew louder, clear now, sweet but eerie, like something from another time. It was haunting. The kind of song that makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. The sound of a choir, voices harmonizing, as though singing a prayer or a hymn. But there was no choir, there were no people, just the walls of this old, forgotten place. "Let's check it out," Mark suggested, trying to shake off the unease in his voice. But even as he spoke, he felt it, the oppressive air around them thickening, as if the very building were holding its breath. They moved down the hallway, their footsteps echoing off the stone floors. The sound of the choir led them deeper into the heart of the penitentiary, to a section of the prison they hadn't explored yet. The walls seemed to close in, the air growing colder with each step. The melody was now deafening, like a dozen voices crying out in sorrow. As they reached the end of the hallway, they found themselves standing in front of a door. Only, it wasn't a door at all. It was just a wall, as solid and unyielding as the rest of the prison. "What the hell?" Chris muttered, reaching out to touch the stone. It felt wrong, slick, cold, like it shouldn't have been there, as though the door had never existed in the first place. Suddenly, the voices stopped. Silence. Complete, suffocating silence. "Did anyone else hear that?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The room felt heavier now, as though they were being watched from all directions. The hairs on Olivia's neck stood up, and she felt an overwhelming urge to leave. But before they could move, the voices came back, louder now, surrounding them. The song was different, darker, filled with an undercurrent of pain and desperation. It was no longer a melody, it was a wail, a cry for mercy. "Open the door!" Mark shouted, his panic starting to show. But the door remained just a wall, unyielding. The voices grew louder, and this time, they weren't just singing. They were crying, screaming, their voices filled with so much torment that Olivia felt it in her chest. The choir was not singing for peace. They were singing for forgiveness, a forgiveness they would never receive. The last cries of the most notorious prisoners in Eastern State, their souls trapped in a never-ending cycle of regret. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the voices stopped. The room was suffocatingly silent once again. Olivia's heart hammered in her chest. She looked around, but there was no way out. No door, no escape. The room had no exits. The walls seemed to press in on them, closing tighter with each passing second. They were trapped, and they were not alone. The walls seemed to shift, and in the flickering light of their flashlights they saw it. A shadow, moving across the walls like a living thing. Figures, twisted and deformed, appearing and disappearing, their faces contorted in agony. The prisoners, the ones who had never left. Olivia screamed as the shadows closed in, their hands reaching for her. She stumbled back, but there was nowhere to go. They were surrounded. And in the darkness, the voices began again, this time louder than ever, crying out for mercy, for release, for a forgiveness they would never get. As the last cries echoed in her ears, Olivia realized the truth. They weren't there to capture the ghosts of Eastern State. They were the ghosts, forever trapped in this prison, just like the souls that had come before them. And no one would ever hear the choir again, except for the ones who had stayed too long, the ones who had never left. Story number 4. The Vanishing Cellmate. In the early 1940s, when the air in Eastern State Penitentiary was thick with the smell of decay and despair, a man named Edward Graves found himself alone. Solitary confinement. That was the sentence handed to him after he tried, in a moment of blind desperation, to escape the iron grasp of the prison. For a man like Edward, locked away in the damp, cold stone of the penitentiary, solitary confinement was both punishment and curse. It was the worst thing they could do to him, and it was the thing that would break him. The cell he was placed in was small, barely enough room to stretch out, and the walls felt as though they were closing in on him. The only light came from the narrow window above his cell door, where a sliver of moonlight barely broke through the grime on the glass. Every night the silence was deafening. The sort of silence that eats away at your soul, the kind that makes you hear things. At first, it was just the occasional creak of the old building settling, or the far-off clatter of something, someone, moving through the halls. But as the days stretched into weeks, Edward started hearing something else. It began with whispers. At first, he thought it was his mind playing tricks on him. Maybe it was the isolation, or maybe he was losing his sanity. But the whispers were too real, too distinct to ignore. They would float through the cracks in the walls, barely audible, as if someone was standing right next to him, just out of reach. Sometimes he thought they were calling his name. Edward. The voice was soft, like a breeze. Edward, we can help you. At first, he brushed it off as just the wind. But night after night, the whispers continued, growing clearer, more urgent. "Help you escape. We'll get you out of here." Edward's curiosity started to grow, as did his fear. He hadn't spoken to another soul in what felt like months. The prison had been built to isolate its prisoners, to break them down until they were nothing. But the whispers promised freedom, a way out of the torment of the stone walls and endless days. One night, unable to resist any longer, he called out, his voice trembling with both hope and dread. "Who's there?" The whisper stopped, and for a moment everything was still. Then, in the darkest corner of his cell, something moved. It was a shadow. At first, he thought it was just the flicker of his mind, but the longer he stared, the more distinct it became. The shadow stretched across the wall, taking the form of a figure. A man, though there was something wrong about him. He was tall and thin, with hollow eyes and a mouth that didn't move when it spoke. But it spoke. "Are you ready to escape?" the figure asked, its voice low, almost gentle. Edward's heart raced. He hadn't seen a living soul in so long, and yet here was someone who could help him. The figure stepped closer, its movement smooth and unnatural, like it was gliding rather than walking. "How?" Edward asked, his voice shaking. "How can you get me out of here?" The shadow smiled, though it wasn't a smile at all. It was more like a grimace, a twisted thing that spread across its face, stretching its hollow eyes wider. "Escape is possible," the figure said, "but you must be willing to pay the price." "What price?" Edward asked, his voice trembling now. The shadow moved closer still, its coldness washing over him, making the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. "A new prisoner," it said softly. "The penitentiary needs one, and it's always hungry." The words settled into Edward's mind like poison. He stepped back, his heart hammering in his chest. "What do you mean? What are you?" The shadow didn't answer. Instead, it reached out a skeletal hand, its fingers long and thin, more like claws than human hands. "Come with me. The prison has already claimed you. You belong to it now." Edward recoiled, panic rising in his chest. "No, I don't want to be a part of this." But the figure was faster than he could react. It moved like smoke, sweeping toward him, filling the air with an unnatural cold. Edward's breath caught in his throat. The walls seemed to pulse around him, closing in like they were alive. "You belong to the penitentiary now," the shadow whispered, its voice taking on a mocking tone. "The shadows always need a new prisoner." Edward backed away, his heart pounding in his ears. But no matter how fast he moved, the shadow followed, always a step ahead, closing in until the walls seemed to melt away. His cell, once a place of isolation, now felt like a trap, his trap. He screamed, but no one came. There was no escape. When the guards found him the next morning, they were puzzled. His cell was still locked, just as it had been the night before. But Edward wasn't there. There was nothing but the cold stone walls and a thick, suffocating silence that hung in the air. And in the shadows of the penitentiary, deep within the prison's heart, the whispers continued, waiting for the next prisoner to answer their call. Because the penitentiary needed them. It always needed a new soul to feed the shadows. Number 5. The Blood-Red Key. It was a night like any other, cold and quiet, the kind that made the world feel like it was holding its breath. Emily and Jason had always been the adventurous types, always looking for something to push their limits, something to break the monotony. And when they heard the rumors about Eastern State Penitentiary, how it was haunted, how it was cursed, they couldn't resist. Everyone said it was off limits after dark, that the spirits of the dead roamed the halls, but that only made it more tempting. They snuck in under the cover of night, their hearts racing, as if the darkness of the place could reach out and pull them in. The crumbling stone walls of the old prison loomed around them, ancient and forgotten, like something that had been abandoned by time itself. The air inside was thick, damp, and smelled of decay, of stories untold and souls long lost. Their footsteps echoed in the empty halls, the only sound besides the occasional squeak of a rat or the distant groan of the old building settling under its own weight. They had no real plan, just to explore, to see if the legends were true, to find something that would make the hair on the back of their necks stand up. But when they stumbled upon the old guard station, hidden deep in the bowels of the penitentiary, they found something they never expected. The room was dark, filled with broken furniture and dust, the air thick with the smell of old papers and rust. There was a small desk near the back, half hidden under a pile of debris. On the floor next to it, almost as if it had been waiting for them, was a key. Not just any key, this one was blood red. The metal gleamed faintly in the dim light of their flashlights, but it was the stain on the floor around it that caught their attention. Deep, dark, and unmistakably fresh, like someone had dropped it there only moments ago. Jason picked it up first, his fingers brushing the cold metal. He held it up to the light, turning it over in his hand, wondering where it could have come from, who it belonged to. "This has to be some sort of prank," he said, his voice a little shaky. Emily was already looking around, her curiosity piqued. "Maybe, but it doesn't feel like one. It feels wrong." Jason shook his head, a grin forming on his lips. "Wrong? It's a key, Em, just a key. Let's find out where it goes." Emily hesitated, but Jason's excitement was contagious. He walked over to a door in the back of the room, a rusty metal door with a padlock on it. The key seemed to call out to him, like it belonged there, like it was meant to unlock something. "Jason, wait," Emily said, but it was too late. He slid the key into the lock and turned it. The sound it made was deep, almost like the groan of the earth itself. The door swung open, creaking on its hinges, revealing a dark, narrow passageway that neither of them had seen before. Jason stepped inside first, his flashlight cutting through the darkness, and Emily followed, her heart pounding in her chest. They didn't know what they expected, but it wasn't this. The passage led them deeper into the prison, further than they had ever ventured, to a room that felt wrong. It was small, just a bare room with nothing but stone walls and a single light that flickered weakly from above. And in the center of the room, something was shifting. It was like a shadow, but not quite. Like something was moving beneath the surface, something that wasn't entirely human. Emily froze. "Jason, what is that?" Jason didn't answer. He was staring at the wall across from them, his eyes wide with terror. At first, she couldn't see what he was looking at, but as she stepped closer, her blood ran cold. On the wall, written in something that looked like blood, were names. Hundreds of names, each one scratched into the stone with jagged, frantic lines. Names of prisoners, but not just any prisoners. These were the names of the most violent, most notorious inmates to ever be locked away in Eastern State. And they weren't just names. They were screaming. The walls seemed to pulse with a low, guttural sound, like 1,000 voices whispering in agony, begging for release. The ground beneath them trembled, and the air grew thick with a sense of overwhelming dread. "Jason, we need to go. Now," Emily said, panic rising in her chest. But Jason didn't move. He stood there, transfixed, as if something was pulling him in, drawing him toward the names on the wall. The key, the blood-red key, was still in his hand, and as he lifted it, the whispers grew louder, more desperate. "Jason, no!" Emily screamed, but it was too late. Jason stepped forward, his hand outstretched, reaching for the wall. And when his fingers brushed against the stone, the room seemed to explode with sound. A deafening, horrifying cacophony of screams, laughter, and whispers all at once. The walls cracked open, and in an instant everything changed. The prison around them seemed to dissolve into nothingness, and Emily felt herself falling through a dark, endless void. When she hit the ground, she was no longer in the prison. She was somewhere else. Somewhere wrong. Jason was gone. There was no sign of him. But the whispers remained. The souls of the violent prisoners trapped forever in this alternate dimension, their rage and sorrow pouring out of them like a flood. And Emily realized, with a cold chill creeping up her spine, that the key had opened more than a door. It had opened a portal to a place where the souls of the most dangerous prisoners were trapped. A place where the only way out was to leave something or someone behind. And Jason? He had become one of them. Story number 6. The Whispering Halls. There's a part of Eastern State Penitentiary that no one talks about anymore. It's tucked away, hidden behind layers of dust and old iron gates that creak on their hinges like they've been forgotten by the world. It's a place where the walls seem to breathe and the air is thick with memories. Memories of prisoners who never made it out. The halls in this part of the prison aren't like the others. They don't echo with the sounds of footsteps or the voices of guards barking orders. Instead, they're quiet, eerily quiet, except for the faint scraping sounds that drift through the cracked stone. No one knows exactly why, but the whispers in this section are louder than anywhere else. And tonight, those whispers were about to find a new audience. It started slowly. Derek had been locked in his cell for what felt like forever, the cold stone walls closing in tighter with each passing day. He wasn't the only one in this forgotten part of the prison. There were a few others, men who had been left behind and forgotten by time. They weren't violent criminals, not the kind the guards liked to talk about. They were just men who had been left here to rot, forgotten by the system, punished more for being forgotten than anything they'd done. It was late. The moonlight filtered through the dirty windows, casting long shadows across the stone floors. Derek lay on his cot, staring at the cracked ceiling, listening to the faint sound of water dripping somewhere in the distance. He had grown used to the silence, to the emptiness that hung in the air. It was the only thing that kept him sane, if it could be called sane, to just let the silence take over. But tonight the silence was different. The whispers started quietly at first. So quiet that Derek wasn't sure if they were real. Maybe it was just the wind, maybe his mind playing tricks on him. But the more he listened, the more the whispers grew. At first, it was just a murmur, like someone talking at the far end of a hallway. But as time passed, it grew clearer, louder, like the voices were coming closer. Derek. He sat up on his cot, his heartbeat quickening. His name had been called, he was sure of it. He listened hard, his breath shallow in his chest. The voices, they weren't human voices, not the kind that belonged to the living. They were low and guttural, scraping the walls like nails against stone. Derek, help us. He stood up, feeling his way through the darkness, trying to ignore the rising sense of dread that crept up his spine. He wasn't alone. He could hear other men moving about their cells now, shuffling, pacing, like they too had started hearing the whispers. The voices called to them, urging them to listen. Get out. The whispers continued. Get out before it's too late. Derek wasn't sure what they meant. He wasn't sure if it was the isolation eating at his brain or if something else was happening. But the longer he stood there, the clearer it became. the whispers weren't just calling to him. They were calling to everyone, and not just in this block. Derek had heard the rumors, the stories from the older inmates who had been around longer than him, about the halls, about the men who had gone mad. But he never thought it would come for him, for all of them. Then came the scratching. First, faint, then louder, and then something more. There were sounds now, noises that didn't belong. Something scraping the walls, something moving just out of sight. Derek's skin crawled. He pressed his ear against the cold stone of his cell, hoping to hear a sound that would tell him it was just his imagination. But it wasn't. The walls were alive, or at least something inside them was. The whispers became clearer, sharper, more urgent. The madness, it's here. And then he heard it. A low growl, a sound so deep and terrible that it sent a chill through his bones. His heart pounded in his chest. The growl turned into laughter, a laughter that shook the very air around him. He backed away from the wall, his mind racing with panic. It was the voices of the men who had come before him. The men who had been driven mad by isolation, their minds broken by the endless darkness of these walls. They hadn't left. They were still here, trapped in the stone, their spirits bound to the penitentiary forever. "Help us. You're one of us now." Derek stumbled backward, tripping over his cot, falling hard on the stone floor. He scrambled to his feet, his breath coming in short gasps. The whispers were everywhere now, in his ears, in his head. The walls seemed to shift, to pulse, like they were alive. "Derek, help us." He had to get out. He had to leave before it was too late. But the door, his cell door, was locked. It always had been, and no matter how hard he pulled on the bars, it wouldn't open. His screams of panic echoed in the empty halls, but no one came. The whispers grew louder, and then there was silence. In the dark, the shadows shifted, taking form. The walls seemed to move closer, and Derek could feel their cold embrace wrapping around him. The laughter grew louder, echoing through the prison. And then, through the darkness, came a voice that was not just a whisper, but a command. "You're one of us now." And just like that, Derek wasn't alone. His mind had joined the ranks of the prisoners who had been driven mad. His body, trapped in the prison, was left behind to roam the halls. Forever. The whispers didn't stop. They never stopped. They called to the new ones, the ones who would be driven mad, the ones who would lose their minds to the silence and torment. The halls were always hungry for a new soul, always waiting for someone to listen to closely. And they always found someone. Story number 7. The Haunted Lockup. Brock Daniels was never afraid. That was his thing. Ghosts, spirits, hauntings, you name it. He didn't just hunt ghosts. He chased them. He lived for the adrenaline, the thrill of knowing something unseen, something dangerous, was just around the corner. His YouTube channel had millions of followers who watched every video with bated breath, waiting for the next terrifying clip of paranormal activity. But for Brock, it wasn't just about the views or the fame. It was about proving he could handle the worst the world of the dead had to offer. That's why he was standing in front of Eastern State Penitentiary on a full moon night, his camera in hand, a faint smirk on his lips. The place had been abandoned for decades, but rumors still swirled about its haunted history. Everyone knew about it, but no one had ever really captured anything solid. No one had pushed the limits like Brock did. He wasn't nervous. Not yet, anyway. The doors of the penitentiary were creaky, ancient, and thick with history. They swung open with a loud groan as Brock stepped into the cold, stale air of the prison. The moonlight cut through the broken windows, casting long, jagged shadows across the cracked floors. The place smelled like mildew, decay, and forgotten souls. The silence was so thick it felt suffocating. He knew the place had a reputation. Prisoners, tortured and forgotten, died here. The walls had witnessed madness, violence, and death. And now it was his turn to see what they had left behind. Brock moved through the halls, recording every step, speaking into the camera with a cocky confidence. "Tonight, we're going to get the real stuff," he said, his voice echoing in the empty space. "This place isn't just haunted by rumors. It's haunted by the truth." But as he moved deeper into the bowels of the prison, something felt different. The air was heavier now, colder, as if the place itself was watching him. There was an old wing of the prison that was off limits, where the cells were locked up, sealed tight for decades. Brock's curiosity got the better of him. He found the door to the wing. It was rusted, old, but still sturdy. His camera light flashed across it, catching something unusual. A set of locks. Old ones, with intricate, worn designs. Too many for one door. They seemed untouched, as if no one had dared to open them in years. Brock grinned, walking toward the locks. "Now, this is what I came for," he muttered. He was always looking for a way to provoke the spirits, to stir up something real. He turned the first lock, the sound echoing through the silence. Then another. And another. The clicks of the locks opening filled the air, like a slow drumbeat, growing louder with each turn. And then, suddenly, a cold gust of wind blew through the hallway, despite the broken windows that let in nothing but stillness. The air turned icy, and Brock's breath came out in sharp clouds. His heart pounded harder, but he kept going, driven by the need for something, anything, to make his name legendary. The door creaked open. At first, there was nothing, just darkness and the scent of old stone and rotting wood. But then, as if the very room had been holding its breath, a sound broke through the silence. A low, guttural whisper. It was a voice. No, 100 voices. All of them murmuring at once, distant and urgent. Brock's hand trembled slightly as he raised the camera, but he didn't stop. He stepped inside, his footsteps echoing off the cold, damp floor. The shadows seemed to shift, and the temperature dropped even more. His breath fogged in the air as the voices grew louder, more distinct. "Help, help." The whispers seemed to reach out to him, tugging at his mind, urging him forward. "They're here. They never left." Brock turned the corner, and his flashlight beam landed on the first cell. It was empty, but the walls were marked with something dark, something that looked too much like blood. As his light moved, more cells came into view, each one darker and colder than the last. And then, he saw something that made his heart stop. A figure, hunched and twisted, standing in the far corner of one cell. Its face was covered by a hood, its hands raised as if pleading. It didn't move, but the feeling in the air shifted, like a pressure that crushed against his chest. "Who are you?" Brock whispered, though he knew the answer wasn't going to be one he could handle. Before the figure could respond, something else caught his eye. Another cell, this one with the door cracked open, revealing the faint outline of another prisoner. Brock walked toward it, his curiosity outweighing the growing fear in his gut. He stepped inside. The moment his foot crossed the threshold, everything went wrong. The air turned heavy, thick with the sound of chains dragging across stone. And then the voices were no longer whispers, they were screams. Screams of agony, of torment, of final moments too horrific to be forgotten. The walls seemed to pulse with energy, vibrating beneath his feet. He looked around, but there was no escape, no exit. The door had vanished, replaced by solid stone. He was trapped. trapped in the very cell that had been locked away for decades. And then they were there. The spirits of the prisoners. The ones who had been locked away, tortured, forgotten. Their faces were twisted in pain, their eyes wide with terror, and they were looking at Brock, their mouths open in silent screams. The whispers came again, but now they were clear. They weren't asking for help, they were demanding it. Relive it. Before Brock could react, the ground beneath him seemed to give way. The room spun, and he fell, plummeting into the darkness. And as he fell, the voices surrounded him, forcing him to relive the final moments of those who had died here. The men who had screamed until their lungs bled, the ones who had begged for mercy that never came. And now it was his turn to experience the true meaning of punishment. The walls closed in on him, the darkness consuming him as he screamed with the spirits, his mind unraveling, his body caught in a cycle of torment he could never escape. When the sun rose the next morning, the penitentiary was silent once more. But Brock Daniels was gone. Just another soul lost to the haunted lockups of Eastern State Penitentiary, forever trapped with the spirits of the past. Story number 8, The Last Meal. The old prison had a way of making time feel like it stood still. The walls were thick with history, with stories of men who had come and gone, some forgotten, others remembered only by the faded chalk marks on the walls of their cells. In the farthest corner of the penitentiary, where the air smelled of damp stone and rust, sat Larry Miller, one of the last men to be awaiting execution. Larry had been in prison for nearly 2 decades, convicted of a crime so horrible that no one ever really spoke about it. He had always kept to himself, hardly ever speaking to anyone. But now, as the days drew closer to the time of his execution, he was different. More quiet than usual, more distant. His cellmate, George Waller, noticed it right away. George had been in this prison for over 5 years, and in all that time he'd never seen anyone act like Larry did in the final days. Most men were full of fear, regret, or anger in the days leading up to their execution. But Larry? He seemed strangely calm. At times, George even wondered if Larry wasn't really there at all, like the man was already gone, a ghost in his own body. It was the request for a last meal that first caught George's attention. It wasn't anything extravagant. In fact, it was rather simple: a steak, medium rare, mashed potatoes, a slice of pie. The prison had a standard procedure for last meals, and they weren't particularly generous, but Larry's choice was odd. Not for the food, but for the way he asked for it. He'd whispered to the guard, his voice barely audible. And when they brought the meal to his cell, there was something strange in the air. A heaviness. A feeling like something was waiting just beyond the walls. George didn't think much of it at first. It was just another part of prison life. Men requested last meals all the time. But as the days went on, things started to change. George's food started disappearing. It wasn't much at first, a bite here, a forkful there. He thought maybe he was just losing his mind, or maybe Larry had snuck over in the middle of the night and stolen his meals. But then it happened again, and again. The food would be gone in the morning, as if someone had taken it during the night. But there were no sounds, no footsteps, no rattling of the bars. Just an empty plate, and a gnawing hunger that didn't seem to go away. It wasn't just the food. George's sleep was disturbed too. Every time he closed his eyes, he felt something watching him. It wasn't the guards. It wasn't his mind playing tricks on him. It was something else. Something darker, something that wasn't quite human. His dreams grew more vivid, more haunting. He saw Larry, sitting in his chair, staring into space, a strange smile on his face. His eyes, hollow and empty, seemed to be looking right through George, as if trying to say something, but unable to. Then, one night, Larry spoke. "George," Larry said softly, his voice barely above a whisper, "it's almost time." George froze, unable to move. He couldn't remember ever hearing Larry speak to him like this, so calmly, so detached. The air in the cell seemed to grow colder, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. "What do you mean?" George asked, his voice shaky. His heart pounded in his chest. He was terrified, but he didn't know why. Larry's lips twisted into a grin, but it wasn't a friendly grin. It was cold. "The meal," he said. "It's my invitation. You'll join me soon, all of us." The next morning, George woke up with a start. His throat felt tight, like he hadn't been able to breathe all night. He looked over at Larry's cot. Empty. He wasn't there. But Larry's last meal was still sitting on the small table, untouched, and the air in the cell felt heavy, like something had been removed, something important. As the day wore on, George felt it, the pull, the strange sensation in the back of his mind, like something was waiting, just out of reach. He felt sick, his stomach twisting in knots. The dreams had gotten worse. He saw the men who had died in this place, faces twisted in agony, eyes wide open, frozen in fear. They were all staring at him, calling his name. And then, as if in a trance, George found himself standing in front of Larry's cell door. It was open, and the meal was still there, cold and untouched, as though time had stood still. The meal that Larry had ordered, the same meal that had been served to every condemned man before their execution. George reached for the plate, his hand trembling. The moment his fingers touched the fork, a surge of cold ran through his body. He gasped for air, but it felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. The whispers started again, louder this time, more insistent. "Join us! Join us!" He turned around, his heart pounding in his chest, and he saw them, faces, pale and thin, their eyes hollow and empty. The prisoners, the ones who had died here, trapped forever in the prison, unable to escape. Their voices were deafening, their words blending together into a horrific chant. And Larry? Larry was there too, standing at the back of the group, his face twisted in that same grin. "Welcome," he said. "You're one of us now." George tried to scream, but no sound came out. He felt his body grow weak, his vision blurring as the darkness swallowed him whole. The last thing he saw before everything went black was Larry's face, smiling, and the sound of a door creaking open, as if to let him in. And then, just like that, George Waller was gone. The next morning, the guards found his cell empty, but they never found George. They never found Larry either. It was as though they had vanished into the walls, into the very stone that had imprisoned them for so long. And the last meal, it was gone too. In the days that followed, the prison was quieter than usual. The whispers died down, and the men in the cells went about their routines, unaware of the new arrival who had joined the others in the afterlife. The cycle of death and punishment never ended at Eastern State. It was a life sentence that couldn't be escaped. Not by anyone, not even by the living. Story number 9. The Man in the Shadows. When Thomas Keller first walked through the gates of Eastern State Penitentiary, he was skeptical. A reporter with a reputation for getting the truth, no matter how strange or unsettling, Thomas had been assigned to write an article on the prison's haunted reputation. He'd heard the rumors, of course, the whispers of restless spirits, the stories of flickering lights, the chilling sounds of footsteps echoing through empty halls. But Thomas didn't believe in ghosts. He believed in facts, in evidence, in things that could be seen and touched. And so, he entered the prison, armed with his camera, his notebook, and a healthy dose of skepticism. The place was eerie, there was no denying that. The prison had been abandoned for years, but it still felt alive, as if the walls themselves were holding on to the memories of the men who had been locked inside. The air was thick with history, with suffering, and the silence was so deep it pressed against his ears. Still, Thomas brushed it off. After all, it was just an old building. It had been decaying for decades. The stories were nothing more than the products of overactive imaginations. He spent his first night in a small room near the heart of the prison, far from the areas tourists usually ventured. He'd heard that this part of the penitentiary was where the most violent prisoners were kept, where the air was thick with the energy of men who had been forgotten, their bodies decaying in the same cells they had lived in. The room was dark, cold, and musty, but it didn't bother him. He set up his things, planning to explore the prison the next day and start gathering material for his article. That's when he first noticed him. At first, it was just a flicker of movement, a shadow that passed just outside the edge of his vision. Thomas looked up quickly, expecting to see a guard or someone from the staff, but there was no one. The corridor outside his room was empty, silent. He shook his head, figuring it was nothing more than his mind playing tricks on him. It had been a long day of travel and interviews, but the next night it happened again. He was sitting at the small desk, scribbling notes for his article when he saw it. A figure standing at the far end of the hallway, just barely visible in the darkness. It was tall, its features indistinct, almost swallowed by the shadows, yet its presence was undeniable. It stood perfectly still, watching. Thomas's heart skipped a beat. He wasn't alone, but when he stood up and moved toward the figure, it vanished. The air felt colder, and his breath came out in a visible cloud, even though the room was far from cold. He checked the hallway, empty. He checked the doors, the windows, the corners, but there was nothing. "Just my mind," he muttered, trying to steady his breathing. "I'm just tired, that's all." The next few days were a blur. Thomas continued his investigation, talking to former guards, prisoners who had been released, and historians who could tell him about the penitentiary's dark past. But the shadow always followed him. Every night it was there, just out of reach, standing at the edge of his vision, waiting, watching, silent. By the fourth night, Thomas could no longer dismiss it. It wasn't just the shadow of a person, it was something else. Every time he tried to get close, it seemed to pull back, as if it were afraid of being discovered. But the truth was, Thomas wasn't sure he wanted to get any closer. The feeling in the air around it wasn't just cold, it was wrong. The shadow wasn't a figure of someone who had once lived. It wasn't a ghost or a mere apparition. There was something alive about it, something hungry. The more he dug into the prison's history, the darker the truth became. The prison had housed more than just criminals. There were rumors that had been hushed up, buried deep in the prison's archives, that some of the inmates had disappeared without a trace, their souls seemingly taken, their bodies left behind like empty shells. One evening, while going through old records, Thomas found something that made his blood run cold. A prisoner named Samuel Gray. He had been one of the most notorious men to ever set foot in Eastern State. Gray had been convicted of multiple murders, his mind twisted by years of isolation. But what made his story so disturbing wasn't the crimes he committed. It was the way he had died. According to the old records, Samuel Gray had been executed, but not by the state. No, he had been taken by something else. The last words he had spoken before his death were, "They take you too. They'll take you if you dig too deep." And then there it was, a sentence that stopped Thomas dead in his tracks. Samuel Gray's soul was never found. That night, Thomas went back to his room, his mind racing. He couldn't shake the image of the shadow, the figure that had been haunting him, watching him, waiting for him. He stood by the window, his breath fogging up the glass, and then, in the distance, he saw it. The figure, just outside his door, standing in the shadows. "Who are you?" Thomas whispered, his voice barely a breath. He was no longer sure he wanted to know. The shadow didn't answer. But as Thomas took a step closer, he felt it. Cold fingers brush against the back of his neck. And then, just like that, the figure stepped forward, revealing its face. It was not the face of a man. It was a twisted, hollow thing, eyes black as pitch, mouth stretched wide in a grotesque smile, the skin of its face drawn tight over bone. And in that moment, Thomas understood. The shadow was no ghost, no spirit. It was Samuel Gray, or what was left of him. The man whose soul had been stolen. The man who had been left behind to haunt this place, to torment anyone who came too close. And now, Thomas was his next victim. "You shouldn't have come here," the figure rasped, its voice like a death rattle. Before Thomas could scream, the figure reached out, and his world went black. The next morning, the prison was as silent as ever. No one knew what had happened to Thomas Keller. His camera, his notes, and his equipment were found, but there was no trace of the man. Only the whispers of the shadows remained, waiting for the next soul to uncover the prison's darkest secrets. And Samuel Gray, he would always be there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the next curious soul to wander too close. Story number 10. The Death Bell. It had been years since anyone had heard the sound of the death bell at Eastern State Penitentiary. The bell, a large iron monstrosity suspended high above the execution chamber, had been silent for decades. No one knew where the bell came from or who had first rung it, but everyone knew what it signified. It was the last sound the condemned would ever hear before they faced their final moments. But tonight, the silence was broken. It happened just after midnight. The prison was empty of noise, as it often was at that hour. No guards walking the halls, no footsteps echoing off the cold stone walls. Just the distant hum of wind rattling the broken windows, and the faint creak of the prison settling under its own weight. Then it came. The bell. At first, it was a faint sound, almost like a dream, but it grew louder with each passing second, its tolls steady and deliberate. The deep, eerie clang echoed through the long, empty halls, sending a chill down the spine of every man still awake in the prison. But there were no prisoners scheduled for execution. There hadn't been for years. Marcus O'Connor, a guard at the prison for nearly a decade, had never heard it before. It was a sound that hadn't been made in his lifetime, a sound that sent a shiver through his bones as he heard it ringing in the distance. He couldn't ignore it. The ringing went on, relentless, as if it was calling to him. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up, and his breath caught in his throat. The death bell hadn't sounded in decades. Who was it for? Someone must have accidentally triggered it, he muttered to himself, trying to rationalize it. But deep down, something in the air felt wrong. Too wrong to just be a mistake. He grabbed his flashlight and hurried down the hallway, his boots echoing softly in the silent night. He passed empty cells and rusted gates, the prison's oppressive silence swallowing up any noise he made. The bell kept ringing, louder now, closer, until he finally reached the execution chamber. The room was empty. There was no prisoner waiting, no executioner standing by, but the bell continued to toll, its deep, mournful sound reverberating through the stone walls. Marcus shone his flashlight around the room. It was exactly as he had left it. Nothing had changed. No one was there. But the bell kept ringing, His flashlight flickered as he approached the bell itself, its iron surface coated with layers of rust and age. It hadn't been touched in years, and yet it was ringing as if it had been just recently struck. Then he heard it. A voice, soft but distinct, coming from the far corner of the room. It was a whisper, a low, guttural sound that seemed to come from the very walls themselves. "Help me, please." Marcus froze, his breath catching in his throat. The voice was familiar, and yet not. It felt like something he should recognize, but the words sent a cold wave of fear crashing over him. He turned, his flashlight illuminating the empty room, but there was no one there, just shadows, just the toll of the bell. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice trembling slightly. The whisper came again, louder now. "You shouldn't have come here. You should have stayed away." Marcus stepped back, his heart racing. The air in the room felt colder, heavier, as if the very space around him was pressing in. He turned and ran back into the hallway, but the bell's tolls seemed to follow him, as if they were right behind him, chasing him. He didn't stop until he reached the security office, where the other guards were huddled together, nervously looking at one another. They had heard the bell, too. "What the hell was that?" Marcus demanded, his voice shaky. One of the guards, an older man named Jimmy, swallowed hard before speaking. "I thought I was the only one who'd heard it." Jimmy looked like he had seen a ghost. His face was pale, and his hands trembled as he lit a cigarette. "The bell hasn't been touched in years," he continued. "No one's rung it since the old days. It's a curse, you know. It's always been said to be cursed." Marcus stared at him, confused. "What do you mean, cursed?" Jimmy exhaled a puff of smoke, his eyes distant as he began to speak. "There was a man once, a prisoner, who was executed wrongfully. They say his name was Samuel Carrick. They say he never did what they accused him of, but they killed him anyway. Some say his spirit still haunts this place. They say he cursed the bell before they hanged him. The bell would toll every time someone was wrongfully sentenced, and every time it did, it brought tragedy, death, destruction." Marcus felt the room closing in on him. "So, the bell, it's calling for someone else to die?" Jimmy nodded slowly, his eyes haunted. "It doesn't just toll for executions, Marcus. It tolls when the prison is about to suffer, when something bad is about to happen, something irreversible." Marcus stared at the older guard. He could hear the bell ringing again, louder now, as if it were mocking them. "It's calling for someone, isn't it?" he whispered. Jimmy didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked at Marcus with a sadness in his eyes. "We're all cursed here, Marcus. We just don't know it yet. Every time the bell rings, it's like the prison itself is being pulled closer to something awful. And once it starts, there's no stopping it." Marcus took a deep breath, his mind racing. The bell was a warning, but what was the warning for? What was it trying to tell them? And more importantly, who would be the next victim? The bell tolled again, its sound vibrating in his chest. The air seemed to grow colder, and a chill ran through him. It was louder now, almost deafening, as if the prison itself was alive, pulling him toward some final, inevitable end. And then, Marcus understood. The bell wasn't just a signal of death, it was a herald of the prison's final destruction, and it had come to collect its due. The spirit of Samuel Carrick was still here, his anger and pain alive in every toll, and no one in this prison was safe. The bell rang once more, and in that final toll, Marcus heard the words, clearer now, "You should have stayed away." And then, in the silence that followed, there was only the sound of the prison breathing, waiting for its next tragedy to unfold.